My name is Dr. J Cardinell, and each week I present a leader challenge for those teaching small groups. Today we're finishing up our series called Teaching Like the Master, and we're going to focus on questions. Jesus often used questions in his teaching. It's hard really to determine how many times because of translation issues, but it's possible he used questions more than 300 times in Scripture. Now, questions are not necessary to communicate information or even to bring about life change, but they are helpful because questions help cement the correct answers in people's minds. Instead of me just telling them, they've thought about the question, they've thought about the answer, and they've determined the truth there. It's a way of bringing about cognitive dissonance, an educator might say. Now, what does that mean? In a way I can understand. It causes a little bit of not knowing. You ask a question, they go, I don't know the answer to that, I don't really know, and they begin to think about it, and it begins to mull around their mind, and they come to an answer, maybe through your guidance. So let's talk about questions today. Let's look at Matthew chapter 11, verse 7. Jesus says, "What did you go into the wilderness to see? A reed swaying in the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothes?" Jesus is addressing those who had come out into the desert to see John the Baptist. And he asks this question, did you come to see a guy finely dressed? Well, the answer to that is obviously no. So the implied question afterwards is, you came to see a prophet, didn't you? And so Jesus is causing them to think about the reason they came into the desert and why they came and who they came to see so that they're more ready to hear what he has to say about the person they came to see. See, it calls them to think a little bit. See, asking questions can help people think a little bit, but asking questions at a small group time is hard. Two difficulties we have is sometimes our questions are too simplistic. Other times they're too airy or esoteric. So how can we ask good questions? First, we need to consider the scope of the question. We have narrow questions and broad questions. Narrow questions have one answer. Yes, no. How old was Methuselah when he died? What did Peter do when Jesus said this? They're very simple questions, but they can help move the lesson forward. That's how I use them. I involve other people in the teaching of the lesson simply by asking a question. Look back up at verse so-and-so in chapter such and such and tell me how many lepers there were. See, it involves them in the lesson. They're looking at Scripture. They're getting involved. We also have broad questions. The answer to broad questions can be varied. There can be all kinds of answers to them. How do you think Mary felt when such and such happened? Or how might this affect the Christian lifestyle? See, you can get all kinds of answers to that. And it causes people to begin to think about application and think about their feelings. And it causes them to really internalize the situation, internalize even the information and what that means for us. So let's consider a few keys to crafting good questions. First, if you want specific information, ask specific questions. Questions should always be used in the service of your lesson goals or the main point of that part of the lesson. It's not just some random question, but also questions need to be specific. Instead of maybe you're studying the life of Abraham and Lot, and you just kind of go along, you say, well, what about Lot? Well, what about Lot? Instead, what about this situation might cause Lot to do such and such? Or how might what's going on around Lot affect this situation or that? Be very specific about your questions to help people guide them toward the answers that you're trying to get them to. Second, express a concept and then ask learners for examples. Paul once wrote, "The love of money is the root of all evil." So you might ask, well, y'all, who else in the Bible maybe loved money too much? Or you might ask, what are some concrete examples in our life of someone who maybe loved money too much and it led to bad things? You see, something they're familiar with, leading to concrete examples, either from Scripture or from daily life. Number 3, ask hypothetical questions to stimulate discussion. For example, you might say, if John the Baptist were to walk in our church today, dressed like he dressed and acting like he acted, would he be welcome in our church? You see, a hypothetical question to get people to start thinking. But questions are helpful. Questions are useful. But we have a problem sometimes in our groups. Sometimes when people walk into a group time or to a, quote, classroom, they go silent. They're mute. They won't talk. They won't say anything. So how do you address a mute group when you're asking questions? Well, the first thing I do is I use group work. Now, if you're like me, you didn't like group work in school. But what I mean here is maybe you're going to have a question that's going to cause people to think about feelings or to look at Scripture and figure something out. Instead of just asking the question to a large group and waiting for them to answer, you say, well, get with the person next to you because they're more comfortable with that person probably anyway. Get with that person and y'all discuss this question. Or you look at Scripture and find this answer. You give them a few minutes and you say, okay, did y'all find anything? And even the person who wouldn't normally talk, their answer might come out to the group because of their partner who will talk. But second, you might pre-enlist someone to answer the question. You might know somebody in your group has a story from their life that really might apply to this. So maybe how Mary felt about such and such. And so you might call them up earlier in the week and say, hey, when I ask this question, can you be ready to answer it? Or I might even call on you to answer this question. I want to prepare you ahead of time if you're willing to do that. So you pre-enlist someone to answer the question. And then after they answer it, you might say, does anybody else have a story like that? They might be more apt to talk about it if someone else has already done it. Number 3, craft better questions to fit the personality or life stage of your group. For example, if you're teaching a group of men, you might not talk a lot about feelings. And you might say to them, hey guys, I'm not going to ask you to answer this out loud, but I want you to consider your feelings in this situation. How would you feel? Think about that just for a second. So you might not talk about feelings, but you have them think about feelings. Maybe if it's a life stage issue, maybe you're teaching some folks who have kids, maybe they're even high school kids or grown kids, and you might say, how did you discipline your child when they were 5 years old? But if you have a group of folks who don't have any kids yet, maybe college kids or young adults, you might, instead of asking, how did you discipline your kid when they were 5 because they don't have any, you might say, how did your mom and dad discipline you when you were 5 years old? So you want to craft a question based on who's in your group and the life stage of your group. Questions can be useful. We've talked about lectures. They can be useful. We've talked about object lessons. They can be useful. Questions can be useful as well. You just got to make sure you craft the right question, the scope, and you craft them in a way that people are ready to answer them, and you help craft questions to bring answers out of people when they're not ready to talk. I hope these 3 weeks have been helpful for you. We'll start a new series in the coming weeks. But until that time, continue to be faithful in teaching your group and drawing them to Jesus and drawing them further along in their faith journey. I'll see you next week.